Hi everybody, and welcome back to Language and Communication.
With me, Dr. Josh Redstone. Today's lecture, which is actually the second of the lectures that I've recorded today in an effort to catch up with all of the material, is all about metaphor and metaphorical meaning. So, before we dive into things, I'll give you a brief overview of our plan for the day and what our learning objectives are. So in this lecture, I want to introduce you to the study of metaphor and give you a background on the study of metaphor and on metaphorical meaning. So we'll be covering three theories of metaphor after I go over some examples of metaphor and explain what's happening when we use metaphor that's of interest to linguists and philosophers of language. Then we'll cover three theories of metaphorical meaning. The naive simile theory, the figurative simile theory, and Davidson's causal theory. And we'll end things off by discussing Black's response to Davidson's causal theory. So here we're going to get into a sort of semantic theory of metaphor versus a common sense view of metaphors. And the interesting thing is that Black's response to Davidson here is based upon, or rather uses, a metaphor used by Davidson in Davidson's paper about metaphor. So that's very meta. We'll see, this is actually very interesting how Black undertakes this. He isolates this metaphor from Davidson, quote, "Metaphor is the dream work of language." That's not the full quote, but we'll get to that. And this is the little exemplar metaphor that Black uses to critique Davidson's theory of metaphor. So that will be fun to look at. Anyway, why don't we get into it? So before I go over the examples of metaphors that are contained on slide 3, let's just get something out of the way, which is not in the slides, but that's important to keep in mind. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between simile and metaphor, and this will be important because according to some theories that we'll look at, similes turn out to have a lot to do with metaphor. Some people think metaphor is just abbreviated simile, right? So the difference between a metaphor and a simile is pretty straightforward. A simile uses like or as. A metaphor doesn't. A metaphor just says that this thing is another thing. Like if I say that Mr. Jones devoured his sandwich like a hungry animal, that's a simile. But if I just say Mr. Jones is an animal, that's a metaphor, right? So that's the difference, at least the difference as it's usually taught in, like an English studies course. And of course, metaphor is used a lot in literature and poetry and so forth. So that's the definition that's being employed here too in a philosophical context. But anyway, here are some examples of metaphor to get us into the spirit of metaphorical expression. And as I go through all of these, you should think to yourselves about which ones are maybe more impactful, are some more or less metaphorical than others. Are any of them particularly striking or insightful? Try and just think. Some are better than others, I suppose, and you'll have to think about which ones are better than others. But here's one. This one's from Kafka. "When one has once accepted and absorbed evil, it no longer demands to be believed." Okay, well, geez, I haven't read a lot of Kafka, but I don't know. It no longer demands. So this is saying that evil demands to be believed. I guess that's kind of metaphorical. What about "love is the perception of individuals" from Murdoch? This seems straightforwardly metaphorical to me. Love is the perception of individuals. If love is A and the perception of individuals is B, then this is saying A is B. So that's a metaphor. No like or as in there, right? This one from Emerson. "I am nothing and I see all. I am a transparent eyeball." There's like 2 metaphors in there. There's like 1 per sentence. "I know the dark isn't coming for the moment if I could hold it." Earl's sweatshirt. Interesting. Here's a straightforwardly metaphorical one. The World is a Vampire by Billy Corgan. This is a Smashing Pumpkins song, I believe. Walter Benjamin, a work is a death mask of its conception. That's pretty metaphorical. A is B. Time collapses between the lips of strangers. Audre Lorde. This one's a bit less straightforward, but it seems sort of metaphorical. It seems striking. It seems very poetic to me. And I've got to state for the record, I'm not well read in literature or poetry or even song lyrics, for that matter. But so I guess what I'm saying is I'm not really qualified to comment on the literary merit of any of this, but this one does strike me as metaphorical. It's not saying that time is something, but it says time does something. Maybe that's why I find it a little more striking, because it's a metaphor, but it's a little bit different, a little bit less straightforward. And finally, Bob Dylan, the ghost of electricity howls in the bones of her face. There seems to be a lot going on in this one, describing electricity as a ghost, and that this ghost howls in the bones of her face. I mean, nothing can howl in a bone, right? So this one's quite nice, as I would expect of Bob Dylan. So anyway, yeah, these are all metaphorical to some extent or another. And as you're going through these examples on slide number 3, think to yourself about which ones are more striking or impactful, or whether some succeed better than others, or whether some just tickle your metaphor bone better than others. Now let's get to what philosophers say about metaphor, right? They agree with the definition that I provided earlier, and that is, when we're using metaphors, most philosophers would say we're comparing two things by bringing out some likeness between the two of them. So perhaps metaphors are not as straightforward as I characterized them before, but then again, that's my 10 or 11-year-old memories of Introduction to English, which I did not excel at. So don't worry about that. But what philosophers agree is that when we use metaphor, we're comparing two things, probably two salient features that are alike in these two things. So, two central questions must be addressed by any theory of metaphor, that is, theory of metaphorical meaning. We have to talk about what metaphorical meaning is, and we have to make sure we understand this. And we have to explain how metaphorical meaning is conveyed by speakers and grasped by listeners. So, I'll just go through this in a bit more detail now. This is all drawn from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on metaphor. I won't provide any links for that one because it's easy enough to find, and it's not required reading, but I recommend taking a look at it if you're curious on learning more about metaphor. But yeah, metaphor describes it thusly, or the SEP describes metaphor thusly. Describes it as this act of comparison, right, where we seem to be likening, analogizing, comparing. So a quote directly from the article reads, it is unclear what we mean when we say this. That is when, metaphor is comparing two things by bringing out some likeness. To the point where some are reluctant to appeal to likeness or similarity in explaining what metaphor is or how it works. Much of the power and interest of many a good metaphor derives from how massively and conspicuously different its two subject matters are. So, in this sense, metaphors seem to reflect a kind of double aboutness. They're about two things, yet about a different similar thing that these things have in common, perhaps. But that's the interesting thing. Perhaps if we can go back to the previous list, maybe that's why this Bob Dylan one popped out at me. The ghost of electricity. Ghosts and electricity seemed like very different things. And ghosts howling or electricity howling. How are these similar? It seems similar or at least understandable in some ineffable way that I can't quite characterize. I can't say explicitly what it is that's grasping me there, but perhaps it's this double aboutness, or this how different everything that Dylan is using in this line is that strikes me so much. So I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't worry about this for now. Indeed, some people argue that metaphors are not really about anything at all, or at least they're not about anything other than what they literally state. And Davidson is one of these thinkers. Davidson espouses a causal account, and he rejects the possibility of metaphors having independent propositional content. And if they don't have such content, well, there's actually an upshot there for Davidson. The upshot is that they are not paraphrasable because there's nothing to paraphrase. I admit I am not expert enough in the philosophy of language to really appreciate why Davidson says this is an upshot, but perhaps we'll come back to this later. In any case, let's move on by looking closely at some more juicy details from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article. This one from Stanley Cavell is taken from his paper Aesthetic Problems of Modern Philosophy, published in 1969. And it seems to kind of get at the source of the disagreement about what we're doing with metaphor, whether we're making a comparison, whether metaphors are about anything at all. If anything, this quote paints a nice, clear picture of the lack of straightforwardness that we find when we try to understand what metaphorical meaning is and how it is conveyed or grasped. So, to quote from Cavell's paper, "Now suppose I am asked what someone means who says Juliet is the sun. I may say something like, Romeo means that Juliet is the warmth of his world, that his day begins with her, that only in her nourishment can he grow. And his declaration suggests that the moon, which other lovers use as an emblem of their love, is merely her reflected light and dead in comparison," and so on. In a word, I paraphrase it. Moreover, if I could not provide an explanation of this form, that is a very good reason, a perfect reason, for supposing that I do not know what it means. Metaphors are paraphrasable. Okay, so Cavell seems to disagree with Davidson about whether metaphors are paraphrasable or not. I mean, even with the Juliet is the sun example, it's difficult to know right off the bat what exactly this means or whether it's supposed to have some kind of primary meaning, right? It depends on our definition of other parts of that sentence, like is or the sun. And I guess this is why interpreting poetry or reading plays and everything is so fun for English majors and stuff, right? But this, Juliet is the sun, is just a simple subject-predicate metaphor. Things can get a little more murky when we get looking at, proper poetry or perhaps aphorisms and like aphoristic uses of metaphor in philosophy. I mean, just try understanding Nietzsche, for example, if you've never read a philosopher like that, without being equipped to unpack all of the metaphors he uses. It'll be tricky for you. So once we imagine that there is such a thing as metaphorical meaning, we still need to explain how it is communicated. So, even if we're confident that Juliet is the sun means something, we have to explain how that meaning is communicated. I mean, just think of if you heard one of those quotes from song lyrics and poetry that I went over earlier in the course of everyday conversation. It would seem like you were talking to a crazy person, right? Talking about the ghost of electricity in people's face. That'd just be weird. Or saying the world is a vampire. Like, in everyday discourse, that's just nutty. And seems to be nonsensical. But in the context of lyrics or poetry, we seem to understand that it has a meaning, and we want to explain how that meaning is conveyed or grasped. So this is all meant to give you a sense of the background to this, to what theories of metaphor are trying to do, right? To deal with these kinds of questions. What is metaphorical meaning, and how is this meaning conveyed or grasped by speakers and listeners respectively? So there are a number of theories that we can cover to try to explain this. The list of them on 5 are a couple I've already mentioned: the naive simile theory, the figurative simile theory, the pragmatic theory from Searle, the causal theory from Davidson, the analogy theory. Until we get to Black's response, we're going to concentrate primarily on the simile theories and Davidson's account. Of course, because Black's response is to Davidson's causal account. So that's how we're going to proceed through all of this. We'll focus on the simile theories and Davidson's causal account. But just to give you the details on the other theories before I jump into the ones that we're going to spend the most time on, a pragmatic theory of metaphor, that is Searle's pragmatic theory of metaphor, treats metaphor as a species of Gricean communication. So here, the hearer understands that the speaker means something other than what she has explicitly stated, or beyond the literal meaning of her utterance, right? Beyond the sentence meaning, you could say, I suppose. Then she figures out the intended meaning, the force and content, etc. of the sentence. Now, I'm not going to say much more beyond that now, but this will come back when we talk about some of the criticisms of the simile theories. All right, so let us move on to slide 6. So on slide 6, we have a recap of some of the features of metaphorical expressions that will be important to keep in mind as we survey these different accounts of how metaphor works. So metaphorical expressions vary enormously in terms of their simplicity and straightforwardness. Some metaphors are extremely simple. Some are very complex and quite obscure, which you can see from the example list that Dr. Wayne prepared, right? The ghost of electricity howls in the bones of her face is a lot more complex and less straightforward than the world is a vampire. Beardsley, for example, claims that all metaphorical expressions, no matter their complexity or simplicity or straightforwardness or lack thereof, share 2 features. One feature is conceptual tension, in that the things that they compare or try to draw a similarity between are actually quite different from one another. Like the world is different from vampires. The world is, the planet Earth. Vampires are mythical, supernatural, blood-sucking creatures of the night, right? Those are pretty different. But we draw a similarity to them. Perhaps the similarity is that the world, like a vampire, will drain you of life until you die. I'm not sure. But that's one plausible interpretation of that lyric from the Smashing Pumpkins song. The other feature that Beardsley thinks that metaphorical expressions share are, it's this idea that in spite of the tension that I just discussed, or perhaps even because of the tension, the expression is intelligible, perhaps even especially informative, poignant, or illuminating, right? So these are the 2 features of metaphor: conceptual tension, and something about that tension, maybe in spite of the tension or because of it, metaphors are informative, poignant, or illuminating. They say something to us, that they convey something, they convey a meaning to us, right? And with our theory of meaning, we want to explain what the meanings are and how they're conveyed and grasped. All right, so let's move on to the first of our theories to explain metaphor that we're going to look at in any depth, and that is the naive simile theory. All right, so the naive simile theory. Well, on the naive simile theory, firstly, it says something about what similes do. Remember, a simile usually uses like or as. So similes express or invite comparisons between seemingly unlike things, like metaphors do. So an example of a simile is, her hair is like a sleepy golden storm, because, it has the is like part in it. So that's a simile. According to the naive simile theory, metaphors do exactly the same thing. They are just abbreviated similes. Remember how Bertrand Russell thought that a lot of singular terms were abbreviated definite descriptions? Well, here, metaphors are just abbreviated similes. So, Juliet is the sun is short for Juliet is like the sun in a literal sense. Or to turn our previous simile into a metaphor, her hair is a sleepy golden storm. Although that sounds a little peculiar to me. So the naive simile theory accommodates the aforementioned features of metaphorical expressions that we went over. The two ideas from the previous slide that, the conceptual tension and the conveyance of something informative, poignant, or illuminating, right? But there are three objections to this idea, mostly from John Searle. So, what does Searle say about the naive simile theory? Firstly, Searle says that the tension is too superficial to really count for anything here. Metaphors, he says, work because they set up a very strong tension between the things they're comparing, right? If they're just similes, the robust tension disappears. So if I say her hair is a sleepy golden storm, there's supposed to be a greater tension there than if I just say her hair is like a sleepy golden storm or Juliet is like the sun, right? So for the metaphor to really work, this is from Lycan now, it requires substantive tension to be inherent in the expression. So, compare her hair is like a golden storm, for example, to a hurricane is like a thunderstorm, right? They're both similes, but one has a greater tension, right? So, the tension is too superficial for Searle. Number two, he thinks that the naive simile theory fails to show or fails to account for how metaphorical significance is conveyed. In other words, it doesn't answer questions like which are the salient features that are conveyed in the metaphor, if metaphors are just abbreviated similes. So for example, if Juliet is the sun is really just an abbreviation of Juliet is like the sun, and it's just a comparison I'm making between Juliet and the sun, many physical features of the two of them need to be excluded in order to get that, metaphorical, insightful, informative, poignant, metaphorical punch, right? So, for the naive simile theorist, there's no means for them to figure out what these salient features are. So that's a problem, says Searle. We could say here, as Lycan does, that maybe it's whatever quality that jumps out at you that is the most salient one. But then there's no way of knowing what exactly is being compared here, right? So when we compare Juliet to the sun, it seems like the most salient feature of that comparison, or the most salient features of the sun in that comparison, are not the ones in which we're interested, right? Objection 3, once the relevant similarities are identified, these two are often metaphorical. For example, if someone was compared to a block of ice, it probably means, in a figurative sense, that they're cold. But that is itself kind of a figurative, metaphorical language. If I say someone's a block of ice and I mean that he's cold, and that's the same as saying that this person is cold, that's still a metaphorical description of that person, right? So is it metaphors all the way down? It can't be. And then we've got an infinite regress, and then we've got a problem. So that's what Searle is saying with objection number 3, is even if we can identify the relevant similarities, they often rest upon other metaphors. So that's a problem. Maybe instead what we need to do is look at the psychological mechanisms that cause us to associate things like coldness and the lack of emotion. And this kind of problem, or these kinds of problems, have led to a revised theory of metaphorical meaning called the figurative simile theory. And that is where we will turn next on slide number 9. All right, so on to the figurative simile theory. So here, what's happening is a sort of modification to the naive simile theory. And what the figurative simile account of meaning and metaphor kind of turns on is the difference between literal similarity versus figurative similarity. Because remember, if metaphor is a simile, then it's drawing some similarities out, right, between two different things. So a literal simile is symmetric, so it should work in both directions. That is to say, if A is literally like B, then B is like A. It should work both ways. Now, similes tend to draw figurative comparisons, and they do a better job of paraphrasing metaphors when they are taken non-literally. So the idea here is that metaphors are best understood as abbreviated figurative similes, not literal similes, but abbreviated figurative similes. The objections we covered to the naive simile theory are resolved with these modifications that give us the figurative simile theory. However, other problems do arise in the figurative simile theory. So, why don't we take a look at what some of those are? Notice also that on the figurative simile theory, we're still left with the same kinds of questions that we started with, right? If metaphors are just figurative similes that are abbreviated, well then what is figurative meaning and how is that conveyed? At least one thing we can say about this account is that it allows for us to identify the features that are being brought under comparison easily, but it's not committed to advancing literal similes, between things like Juliet and the sun, a literal comparison between a human and a giant ball of gas, right? So maybe this notion of salience, that is, what is apparent or what stands out, can help us to find the mechanism behind similarity comparisons here, right? So what do I mean by salience? Well, imagine if I was telling you about some cute woodland creature that I saw at camp. Maybe it was a chipmunk, but maybe my friends from some part of the world where they don't have these animals. So to try and explain the chipmunk, what a chipmunk is to my friend, I probably wouldn't compare it to a rat. Even though chipmunks and rats are quite similar, they're both foraging rodents with dubious morals, as Lycan points out. The salient feature here that I want to, identify in something else so that I can compare it to a chipmunk is cuteness. And at least according to the textbook, rats are not cute. I don't know, some rats are cute. Pet store rats might be cute, but maybe the rats in the streets are not as cute. I don't know. But anyway, this is the idea of salience. I need a salient feature to compare two things. So I probably want to compare the chipmunk to something else that's cuter than a rat, because that's my salient feature. Perhaps I'd compare it to a squirrel instead. So now notice this standard of salience reverses when we're making figurative comparisons, right? So I can say Winston Churchill was a bulldog, and I draw out salient figurative features of each subject. But it doesn't quite work the other way, right? If I say this bulldog was a real Winston Churchill, that's a bit less straightforward, right? But in the initial comparison, what I'm trying to do is draw out some similarity between Winston Churchill and a bulldog. This could be similarities in personality or in appearance or whatever, right? Well, not too much in appearance, because after all, Winston Churchill was a human and bulldogs are bulldogs. Some of the new difficulties acquired by the figurative simile theory are that expressions which are accepted as metaphorically true might turn out to be clearly false if we translate them to similes. like if I say Richard is a pig, I probably mean something different than when I say Richard is like a pig. Well, how is he like a pig? What are the relevant similarities? But if I use the metaphor, Richard is a pig, the relevant similarities, just kind of pop into your head. Perhaps he is gluttonous. But the problem is, pigs are not particularly messy or dirty or anything really like their common stereotypes, at least no more or less than any other mammals. If I'm saying Richard is like a pig, I'm trying to draw a comparison that doesn't really work in the same way as when I use a metaphor. So that's what this means. If we translate a metaphor to a simile, it might be false in that way. Secondly, sentences can be interpreted literally or figuratively, of course, right? So this is a problem for metaphor. Do I mean them literally or figuratively? What if I said something like, Adolf is a butcher? I could be literally describing my friend Adolf, who is a butcher. Or I could be describing Adolf Hitler and his war crimes and so forth, right? And finally, many metaphorical expressions are too complex or convoluted to be parsed as similes. So it's not clear, even on the figurative simile theory, that metaphors are really abbreviated figurative similes. So, while the figurative simile theory might work for very simple metaphors, there are a lot of metaphorical expressions that are too complex or convoluted to be parsed as similes, right? Just think back to, again, the lyric from the Bob Dylan song presented on one of the earlier slides. It's particularly difficult to me, for me anyway, to try and make a stab at translating that into a figurative simile. And have it mean whatever it was that Bob Dylan meant by using it as a metaphor. So anyway, let's move on to Davidson's causal account now. So when a metaphor is used, according to Davidson, the listener or the reader is induced to consider a primary subject in a special light. And that special light is made possible through the juxtaposition with the secondary subject. So if I'm saying A is B, A is the primary subject and B is the secondary subject. You remember from Intro to English Studies, right? So this juxtaposition allows for a kind of framing effect to take place. And metaphors, according to Davidson, have no meaning in themselves, or because they have no meaning in themselves, are paraphrasable only in the sense of having this framing effect explained. There is no actual metaphorically expressed or conveyed message that can be restated in different words. It's just that metaphors have this interesting psychological effect on the person who is hearing it or reading it, which means linguistically, metaphorical meaning is just the same as literal meaning for Davidson. So there is no distinctive difference between metaphor and literal speech. And metaphors are only paraphrasable in the sense that we can explain why or how they have the psychological effect that they do. We can't paraphrase what they're saying because, according to Davidson, they're not really saying anything. If metaphors don't have unique meanings, speaking linguistically that is, then what makes them interesting? What gives them their meaning power? Like, how do they mean things if Davidson is right here with his causal account? So this was all on slide 13. Moving on to 14. We'll expand on this. This view, which is also sometimes called the brute force account, you can characterize it by saying there's no special linguistic meaning that is expressed by metaphor. And this actually means that metaphorical language is not a topic for linguists, which is weird because so far, linguists and philosophers of language are the ones we've been talking about, who have been talking about metaphor. So what metaphors do is kind of force us to attend to a novel or surprising likeness between the primary and secondary subject. Similes, in contrast to metaphors, merely kind of nudge us toward attending to that likeness, whereas metaphors kind of force us to see the likeness or draw this or notice this connection, this surprising or novel connection between two things. So metaphors for Davidson are just special because they have interesting psychological effects, as I said recently when discussing the previous slide. Structurally, metaphors are really like nonsense sentences, but they have meaningful and interesting psychological effects on this causal account. So these are two arguments that are typically given for this causal account. One is that there are no rules governing the generation or interpretation of metaphor. So there's no test for metaphor that does not call for taste, as the saying goes. And also, metaphors are open-ended, non-propositional, and not susceptible to paraphrase. This is kind of what the causal account turns on. But note that Davidson is not denying metaphorical meaning here, at least not exactly. He's denying that linguistic expressions change their meaning through metaphor, and he's denying that they're paraphrasable, certainly, but he does not deny that they have some kind of meaningful effect on the reader or the listener. It's just that this isn't a matter of linguistic meaning. This is a matter of this forced framing that happens between a primary and secondary subject. So Davidson reduces and deflates metaphorical meaning, but he doesn't really deny it. Are there problems with this? Yes, there are some criticisms that we can raise against this account, and we'll go over them now. So some of the implications that the causal account leaves us with, which we have to deal with, are given on slide 16. One of the implications of Davidson's account is that there's no cognitive difference between word salad, nonsense sentences like we saw back in chapter 1 of Lycan's textbook, and metaphorical language. But is that right? So one of the problems here is that we're able to gain insight from metaphors. Metaphors tell us something, they communicate something to us. But is that just from their strange literal meanings? This is something that's not really answered in the causal account. Another implication is that there are no better or worse metaphors or ways of interpreting a metaphor. And this also doesn't seem right. Here, I guess, this would mean that we can never be wrong about what a metaphor means. We would only be able to account for the difference between better or worse metaphors would maybe have to do with mental architecture or something, which is a whole other cog-sci rabbit hole that it's probably best not to go down. But if you like, go back and repeat that exercise where we looked at all the examples of metaphors from poems and song lyrics, and see if you can notice differences in, what you perceive to be the quality of those metaphors, right? Are some better or worse? Do some succeed or not succeed? Go back and take a look. There seems to be a difference between a lot of those metaphors. And this would mean, another implication would be, as I've already mentioned, that there is no such thing as metaphorical truth. But if that's true, if the linguistic meaning of metaphors is just their literal meaning, and almost all metaphors appear false on a literal reading, Juliet is the sun, that's false on a literal reading. And moreover, if many or most so if almost all metaphors appear to be false on their literal reading, many or most linguistic expressions will also turn out to be false. And that's not good if we're trying to explain where linguistic expressions get their meaning from. Okay, so let's review what I've talked about so far of Davidson's causal account, also known as the brute force account. Here, metaphors force us to attend to a novel or surprising likeness between a primary subject and a secondary subject. Linguistically, metaphorical meaning is the same as literal meaning. So Davidson is saying that no special meaning is being expressed by a metaphor. The listener is instead induced to consider the primary subject in a special light, or framed against or juxtaposed against the secondary subject, right? And it's this juxtaposition that allows for this framing effect to happen. And that's how metaphors work. They work because of psychological mechanisms like this framing effect. And they're special only because of this psychological effect or other similar kinds of psychological effects, not because they have meaning in themselves. Davidson thinks they don't have meaning in themselves because they're paraphrasable only in the sense that we can explain their psychological effects. We can't say that they mean anything and then come up with a sentence to say what it literally means. There is no metaphorically or expressed or conveyed meaning that can be restated with different words for Davidson. That is the review and summary of Davidson's causal account. That's on slide 17 if you're following along. And now we're going to move up to slide 18, and we're going to start taking a look at Black on the common sense of metaphors. So let's talk about Max Black's work on what he calls the common sense of metaphors. Black here is trying to illustrate this thing he calls the common sense of the production and understanding of metaphor. And what he does here, what he does to try to accomplish this, is conduct an analysis of Davidson's remark at the beginning of a paper published by Davidson that Black is responding to. And that sentence reads in part, "Metaphor is the dream work of language," which is itself a metaphor and seems to mean something. Of course, Davidson doesn't mean for it to mean something, perhaps, but Black argues that it does. In any case, what Black is going to call the common sense of metaphor is rejected by Davidson, okay? So Black is describing the common sense of metaphor in opposition to Davidson. The common sense of the production and understanding of metaphor is, in other words, what Davidson is rejecting. So what Black says about Davidson's causal account is as follows. Basically, according to Black, Davidson's view just treats metaphors as a perversely cryptic substitute for literal similes. I'm paraphrasing the exact quote here, but you can find it on 140 of Black's paper. So in light of this reading, Black takes Davidson's objection to a semantic interpretation of metaphor in turn, and he concludes that Davidson's view is unjustifiably reductionist. Davidson seems to want to reduce metaphor, or at least he explains metaphors in terms of doing nothing more than bringing unexpected similarities to light, right, through this psychological framing effect. There's nothing interesting, there's nothing linguistically going on here, meaning-wise. Everything interesting that's happening here for Davidson is psychological in nature. So that's why this is reductionist. It's reducing language to psychology, right? But Black thinks that Davidson is unjustified in being this reductionist because he thinks that metaphorical expressions do a lot more than just bringing these similarities to light because of some psychological framing effect. So according to Black, what Davidson is doing is arguing these three positions, and you can find these on slide 20. So according to Davidson, or rather, according to Black, Davidson is arguing, firstly, that metaphor producers, so that's speakers or writers who use metaphor, are saying only what would be understood in literal terms. Then he says, Davidson is secondly arguing that the sentence that is produced, the sentence that contains the metaphor, has only literal meaning. And thirdly, Black says that Davidson is arguing, the third proposition Davidson is arguing for is that metaphor producers draw attention to some likeness between things, right? So this is a reading of what Black this is how Black reads Davidson. This is Black's rephrasing of Davidson's causal account of metaphor. But Black's account is a little bit different. Remember, Black's account is all about the common sense of metaphor. So what are these general features of the common sense of metaphor? Well, one is that a metaphorical expression says something distinctive. Another is that the speaker of the metaphor, or the writer of the metaphor, means to say something distinctive. So a metaphor, firstly, expresses something distinctive, and the author of the metaphor has intended for that to be the case. The speaker means to say something distinctive in that the expression is not intended to be taken literally. So you're not supposed to get the literal meaning of the metaphor. You're supposed to get the metaphorical meaning, the figurative meaning. And finally, another feature of the common sense of metaphor is that metaphor can be understood or misunderstood, right? I can succeed or fail to understand a metaphor, as evidenced by my mediocre grades in English studies class. You know, we can embrace or reject a metaphor. We can fail to get it. And if we can be wrong about them, then they must be saying something. There must be some meaning contained in metaphors, right? Now, these features are all introduced and explained by Black as he kind of analyzes Davidson's remark. And you should really go through this part of the paper. It contains quite a list of readings of Davidson's quote, "Metaphor is the dream work of language." And this is Black trying to show that, you know, you seem to be trying to say something distinctive, and you seem to mean to say something distinctive, and I can understand you or misunderstand you. It's just a great exercise you should do for yourself. And it's in the beginning of Black's paper. So in any case, Black thinks that what Davidson is doing with his causal account is basically caricaturing the common sense notion of metaphor. But Black, Black points out that nobody actually thinks that, you know, when you use a word in a metaphor, you're making some kind of permanent change to a word or a phrase. It's really all depending on the context, right? The metaphor maker could be, quote, attaching an altered sense to the words he is using in context, end quote, to pull from the textbook there. And again, if this isn't clear, go through that list in Black's paper of ways of reading Davidson's provocative metaphor that he begins his own paper with. So what are some points of contention between these two accounts? Well, Black offers this ordered list of assertions that he takes to be true of Davidson's remark, which he calls R throughout his paper. This remark R, metaphor is the dream work of language. That's the list I was referring to. And basically what, this is kind of what I just said a moment ago, but what's going on here is Black is kind of showing us how the metaphor could be understood, how the metaphor maker, that is Davidson, alters literal meaning, and the nature of metaphor making as a kind of speech act. So again, go through this list and try to pick out what kinds of points of contention are arising here between Black and Davidson. When I read this quickly, again, in an effort to get caught up, but this was probably the most entertaining point of the readings of this class so far for me, was just Black relentlessly providing example after example of how we can understand or not understand this metaphor, and how Davidson has altered the literal meaning of the words he's using, and so on and so forth. So definitely take a look at it for yourself. So I guess to kind of tie this all together, you know, the view of metaphor as a speech act leads to some problems, right? One is that it's unclear how and why metaphorical language could ever be effective. And it will almost always make more sense to use similes if there are no semantic differences between, a candidate simile and a candidate metaphor. And the view of metaphor as a speech act, some say, supplies no insight into how metaphors work and why they seem significant. So maybe thinking about metaphor as a speech act could help us make sense of Davidson's view here, like using words to do things, to get people to do things. But Davidson seems more concerned about the effects that metaphors have on people, right, rather than what the metaphor maker is trying to do by uttering the metaphor. So, in a way, what he's doing is emphasizing the perlocutionary rather than the illocutionary dimensions of metaphor and of metaphor use and metaphor discourse. So Davidson seems interested in the perlocutionary force of metaphorical discourse, and this is basically this means that Davidson is looking at metaphor as a speech act. But this leads to serious objections, right? And basically, there are three of them here on slide 23. One is that if metaphor is a speech act, it's unclear how and why metaphorical language could ever be effective. So, if a metaphor is like a speech act and the producer is trying to draw attention to some likeness, but similes are just trivially true, how could metaphors ever be effective? Right? If there's some kind of abbreviation for these or something else entirely. So the first objection is that it's unclear how and why metaphorical language could ever be effective. The second is that it will almost always make more sense to use similes if there is no semantic difference between your candidate simile and your candidate metaphor. But of course, if similes are just trivially true, how could metaphors be effective? I don't know. Another criticism is that the view of metaphor as speech acts doesn't really supply us with any insight into how metaphors work or why they seem significant. So just to wrap things up, as Black wraps things up in his paper, going over a defense of the interaction view, as it's called, basically Black is presenting and defending a semantic interpretation of metaphor, and he's responding to some of Davidson's objections, which are listed on the final slide, slide 24. One of the objections that Davidson offers is that there's no accounting for metaphorical meaning beyond taste. Admittedly, I'm not quite clear on what Davidson means by this, but Black disagrees. Black says that the metaphor user is employing conventional means to produce a non-standard effect. So it's not a matter of taste grasping the meaning of a metaphor, if I'm understanding this correctly. If the meaning of a metaphor is typically creative, it's not inferable from the standard lexicon. So it's not a matter of taste. It's more comprehensive than that. It's a matter of, well, it may be some kind of framing effect, but maybe that effect would simply go beyond whatever taste means here. The next one, the notion of metaphorical meaning grants no explanatory power. No, Black disagrees. After all, non-standard use of linguistic expressions demands a non-standard interpretation. Just compare when we're, trying to understand an expression of irony or an ironic expression or something like that, right? The point is here, whether we're talking about metaphor or irony or sarcasm or whatever, when there is a literal standard explanation that doesn't work for a given context, we have to go elsewhere, right? No big deal. Would metaphorical meaning have to eclipse standard meaning? No. Extended or ironic meanings, for example, don't evaporate the standard meaning of linguistic expressions. So there's no worries there. What about this one? Davidson says if metaphors had distinctive content, that would be readily identifiable. Black counters this by saying, to say something with suggestive indefiniteness is not to say nothing. So Black thinks that metaphors do, in fact, have distinctive content that we can identify. And finally, the effects of metaphor are not generally propositional. Black actually agrees here with Davidson. All right, Black agrees, generally speaking, with the last point. The effects of metaphor are not generally propositional, but he doesn't think that by juxtaposing or comparing, a primary and secondary subject in a new light or in a new way of psychologically framing it, that this is not incompatible with some propositional content. So that is that for Black. All right, everyone, so I know this has been a dense one. The readings for these lectures are tough. So, as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. I imagine all of you are probably busy writing your papers right now, but nonetheless, when you come back to the lectures and you watch this one, do let me know if there's anything that's not clear. I feel like I did a fair bit of jumping back and forth between different things today, and that's because I'm trying to get caught up, but at the expense of getting to sit with the material for a bit. So I apologize if I've jumped back and forth and here and there too much. If you need any clarification on anything, let me know. I am at your disposal. But that is it for today. I'm going to try and have this edited and uploaded, should be Tuesday, sometime on Tuesday. The previous lecture will have already gone up, probably also on Tuesday at some point. In any case, yes, I hope you're all doing well with writing your papers, and I will see you all next time. Bye for now, everybody.